Welcome to this Fortify Unplugged session on REST API. Enjoy the demo.
REST APIs have become kind of a big pain point for a lot of users because it's very difficult to do an automated scan. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and then I'll show you what we've come up with as our solution. And basically, just for some background, REST APIs have had their own kind of definition. SOAP is very well defined. You have the WSDL. There's one way to define a SOAP API, and it's with the WSDL, and it has all the information you need. It tells you the security information, tells you what the payloads look like, it tells you all the endpoints. There's no guesswork. So that's nice because you have everything you need to talk to that, but it sort of invalidates, some of the principles of the web, which have to do with discoverability. A big part of what makes the web work is that you don't have to pre-negotiate what the APIs look like. There's a protocol that defines how you send information back and forth, but what that information is doesn't really matter. You should be able to discover the service. So that's great, but a lot of REST APIs aren't really built with discoverability in mind. There's been some attempts to solve that problem. There was a thing called Waddle, which was an attempt to be like the WSDL but for REST. It wasn't really widely adopted, at least from what I've seen out in the wild. There aren't a lot of REST APIs that use Waddle definitions. And I think some of the big problems with it were that, one, it described the endpoints, but it didn't really describe the payloads. There wasn't very good tooling, so there wasn't really a reason for anyone to go to the trouble of adopting it. And then there's other competing standards. The Atom protocol became big with RSS feeds. And then others came along, and one of the ones that came along somewhat recently in the last year or so is Swagger. And Swagger's kind of started to take over the world in terms of REST API documentation. So we chose Swagger to build our solution around because it's really nicely done. There's a big community around it. A lot of people are adopting it as their tool of choice for documenting their REST APIs. And there's a lot of great tooling around it, which I'll kind of show what that looks like. So just as a quick preview, if you've never seen it, this is the sample API. If you go to the Swagger site, they've built their own little test API called the Pet Store, and it's just used to demonstrate the Swagger tooling. So if you want to see what Swagger really is, it's really this. It's this JSON blob, which is hard to read, but in this describes every endpoint, the payloads, expected return status codes, any security information, tons and tons of information about the API. The smart thing that Swagger guys did was they didn't just create this schema to describe the API. They also created tools to parse it and make it human consumable as well. So this is one such tool. It's called Swagger UI, and it gives you a really neat way to explore the API. So you can drill into each endpoint. You got nice documentation about what it is. You got example payloads, and you can play with it right here. So I can actually hit this try it out button, and it will send the request, and it will show me the response. Not just show me the response, it gives me a curl, example curl command. I can take that and drop that in my command line. So it's really cool because I'm building a client. I can not just test it out, but I could build a command line script, a command line client, just by building out a bunch of curl commands. So it's really, really cool that they've got this, and there's way more tools than this. They've got generators for just about any language. So if you've got a Swagger definition and you're trying to build a Java client for it, there's tools out there that'll generate the Java code or the C# code or whatever. There's tools that'll convert between different formats. So if you've got a WADL or a RAML or some other REST descriptor format, you can convert that in Swagger and then make use of the Swagger tools. So just going back to some of the issues. So discoverability of endpoints, right? It's not usually possible to crawl a REST API because if the API is just sitting out in space by itself, what are you going to crawl? I mean, you've got to be able to find the endpoints. If you're lucky, you've got a website that exercises the API, and you can crawl the website with WebInspect, and we will find that they're making the AJAX calls or whatever to the REST endpoints, and we'll capture that traffic and we'll fuzz it, and that works just fine, assuming that the application exercises all the REST endpoints, which may not be the case. There may be, it's possible that the website or web client that you're crawling only exercises a small number of the API, and there's way more attack surface that's just not being exposed. The other problem is, even if we know all the endpoints, like we have the WADL definition, that's fine. That tells us that there's a post endpoint to a /pet endpoint. But so what, right? I mean, we need to know what the payload is, because if you just try to send an arbitrary request body to that endpoint, most likely the application is going to reject that request. You're going to hit the MVC router that's sitting in front of the application code, and it's not going to route that request into the application because it doesn't conform to the expected request, doesn't have the right payload, or it's going to fail some validation early on. You're never going to get to the code that's touching the database or touching the file system. You're not going to be doing a very good test on that. And then the third big issue is URL parameters. So when we see something like this /customer/1, we don't automatically know that number one is a parameter. It's just a URL segment as far as we're concerned. So we have a way in WebInspect where you can manually define those, but that can be very tedious. I mean, if you've got lots of endpoints with lots of URL parameters, it's going to take a long time to go and create those URL parameters automatically or manually. So that's where the tool that we've developed comes into play. It does all this for you. So I'll show you real quick what it looks like. It's a command line tool. It ships with WebInspect. So I'm going to run it from the command line and just show you real quick what it produces. So it might be hard to see on the screen, but it's this WISwag.exe. I'm going to pass it an input parameter, which is -i, and then the URL of the Swagger JSON, which is not this, right? This is the Swagger UI, but it's this. It's the actual JSON. It's the actual Swagger definition. And then I'm going to tell it to generate a settings file, a WebInspect settings file. There are other output options, but the settings is the recommended one because it's got a lot of information, and I'll show you what you get. So if I run that, it's going to go out, it's going to fetch that Swagger, it's going to parse it out, and then it's going to generate the settings, and it's done. So if I go into WebInspect and I say, let's start a new scan, and I'm going to load that file, and go to the location where I've stored it. We can see this is what it generated. So it went ahead and set it up as a workflow scan. It's an audit only because we're not going to crawl it because as we'll see, we've already generated all the payloads. If we go and look at the macro that it created, the workflow macro, and just edit that, we can see that what it did was parse the Swagger, and it generated all of the payloads, and not just the URLs, but also the request body payloads. So if I send one of these, you can see I'm getting back a valid response. if all you had was the request and you didn't know, or if all you had was this, which is what the waddle would give you, right? It would say, well, there's a post endpoint on pet. Okay, well, what am I supposed to send down here? You can see you can't just send whatever you want. Well, okay, in this case you can, but if you didn't know what it was, if the application was very particular about the payload, then you wouldn't be sending something that the application would expect. And even though the application accepts this empty JSON blob, that doesn't really give anything useful for WebInspect to do, right? So what are we supposed to fuzz here? What are the interesting parameters? If we have the full payload now, WebInspect already knows how to parse JSON and step inside. So we're going to fuzz all these things. We're going to fuzz that. We're going to fuzz that. We're going to fuzz all these values. So you're going to get a much more comprehensive coverage in terms of penetrating into the application. So we've got all the endpoints here, and everything should work, and we should get good audit results. Now, that's great, but even with this, you might see some problems immediately. Like, okay, well, what about these delete endpoints? Do I really want to fuzz those? Maybe, maybe not, right? Because that could actually impact your scan downstream. So if we send a post and we create a new pet with the ID of 123, and then later on, some point in the scan, we delete it, because we're asynchronous, right? We start auditing and we're just fuzzing all the endpoints kind of as they come in. It is possible that we could delete that entity while we're still fuzzing on one of the endpoints that rely on it being there. So there's a lot of cases where you want to be able to tune the output, and you can do that. We don't have a nice UI on this, but it's still possible to do, and that's because the tool can take in this configuration file, and it's not so complex. This is what it looks like, and this is basically an alternate input. So instead of passing in the to the -I, instead of passing in the location of the JSON, you would pass in the location of a configuration file instead. So here I've got this petstore.WISwag, and I'll just kind of step through what I've got. So API definition, that's required. That's the actual location of the Swagger. You can override the host, and this is useful because by default, the tool will parse the host out of the Swagger definition if it's defined there. If it's not defined, because sometimes it's empty, it'll try to pull it out of the location. If that fails, then you will have to define a host. Otherwise, we can't generate proper requests. The other reason why you'd want to redefine the host would be that sometimes you'll get a Swagger definition that's pointing to QA1 server that you don't have access to. They've given you this Swagger definition. The REST API exists on the staging server that you're testing against, but the Swagger definition references some other server that you don't have access to, even though it's the same API. You need to tell the tool to generate requests that point to the host that you have access to. So that lets you override that value. Same thing with schemes. If you want to be able to test the HTTPS and HTTP, but the definition only defines one or the other, you can tell it generate traffic for both. Preferred content type, again, this is typically, I'm actually going to tell it to use JSON instead of XML. This is, some endpoints can define, that they support both or multiple types of payloads, and maybe you just want to focus on one just to streamline the test, because if you tell it to generate all the results, we're going to be testing the JSON, we're going to be testing the XML, it's probably not necessary because it's all hitting the same code on the back end, so you can tune it and tell it, just generate one. If I'm given a choice, if this endpoint gives me a choice, choose JSON is what this is saying. Exclude methods. So this goes back to what I was talking about before. This can be really useful if you want to exclude all the delete methods. And this is an array, so if there was other ones that you wanted to filter out, you could do that. There's other options as well. I'm not going to go through every single option because I think that most of them should be self-explanatory, but I can just briefly call out that there's also, so that's for HTTP methods. There's a similar option for operations. So if you look at a Swagger definition, they all have an ID. So every operation has a unique ID. So there's one called add pet. There's one called update pet. There's one called find pets by status. So you can actually refer to those in this definition file. So if you wanted to say exclude the add pet operation, you can list them out one by one if there were specific ones you didn't want to include. And the inverse of that, there's an include operation. So this would be a whitelist, and basically it says if the whitelist is defined, then it'll exclude everything but the ones that are in this whitelist. So if you had one or two that you wanted to test and exclude all the other ones, instead of having to create an exclude list that was, a mile long just to get to the one that you cared about, you can use the include operation instead and just include the one you want, and everything else will be excluded. The other really useful thing is this parameter rules override. This allows you to tune the request payload of the output. So you can get pretty fine grained with it. So the general construct here is you can provide a name, and that would be the name of the parameter. You can provide the value that you want to give. So this is similar to the SOAP, the web service designer tool where you can define default values. And then you can tell it, you can kind of tune it. So there could be a lot of parameters called pet ID. Well, probably not pet ID, but sometimes you'll have this situation, right? You have a parameter that's just called ID, and it shows up in lots of different operations. Sometimes it's got a certain value, sometimes not. So if you know that you only want to set the ones with the type as a number. So you've got an ID that shows up, sometimes it's type string, sometimes it's type number. You only want the number value to change. You can define it there. If you don't give it a type, then it'll find everything. You can also give it you can also do an include operations here, or an exclude. So if I say include operations, add pet, it'll only change the parameter with the name ID in the add pet operation. So it won't do it globally. If I don't include that, that's going to do it globally. So let me change this back. The other thing you can do is you can inject parameters. So this will match parameters, or this will find parameters that match these results. But what if you need to do something like inject a parameter that doesn't exist? And the common scenario for that would be like an authorization token. So that's why there's an inject flag. So if you say inject true, I'm saying location header, I'm saying give a name, authorization, and then the value with the token that I've sort of pre-generated. This will, regardless of whether or not this parameter exists in any of the requests, it will add it. So it'll add a header called authorization. So let's look at what this looks like. Let's go back to, so this was the old one. I'll just show you real quick. This was the one that we generated previously. You'll see it doesn't have the authorization header. You'll see, oh yeah, pet ID. Okay, so pet ID 123. I'm going to load the new one, and we'll see how that's different. And we'll see the differences. So the first thing you notice is there's no deletes, right? There's no delete operations, and that's because we excluded those by using this exclude HTTP methods. The other thing is we said, okay, wherever there's pet ID that has a type of number, we want to set the value to 42. The default is 123. So you can see this quantity still gets the default value of 123 because we don't have a rule, but pet ID now has a value of 42. And the other thing to notice is we told it to inject a header parameter called authorization, and you'll see that in every request there is authorization header injected. So yeah, you can do the header thing in WebInspect, right? You can specify custom headers, but I think if you're going to be tuning the payloads anyway, it could be easier to do here. The other thing is, this being a command line tool, you could script that. So if you've got a token that changes periodically, you could, in theory, have a script that goes out, hits the token refresh endpoint, gets the new token, updates your config file to change this value, and then run this script back through the WISwag tool, and then you'll have the updated token without having to go into WebInspect and manually change that value. So this can be really good for automation, and that was the primary reason why it was created first as a command line tool, because this fits in primarily with automation workflows. We may build a UI around this. That would be kind of the next logical step, I think. But right now, there's a lot you can do with it, even just being a command line tool. So let me show you some results real quick, and I'll kind of show you what it looks like from WebInspect's point of view when you don't have a Swagger definition. So here is what it looks like, because one of the other questions you might have is, well, hey, this is a web page, right? Doesn't WebInspect scan web pages? Like, why can we not just scan this? I'm still investigating, because it does seem like on the surface that we should be able to scan these. The problem is there's a lot of JavaScript going on here. It's not just simple web forms. In order for these values to be populated, there's a lot of user interaction that happens. So when you look at the DOM of this page, there's actually not much for our crawler to scrape and crawl. So these aren't really web forms. These are all like JavaScript user interaction things that are happening. So it's very cool. It's very slick, but it's basically, it behaves like a single page application. So when we crawl it, this is what it looks like. And even when I turn on the new single page application support in WebInspect, it does a little bit better job, but it's still not great, because the way they generate these payloads into the forms still requires some user interaction. And that's something that we probably need to fix. But at the end of the day, it's still not going to give great results, and you're not going to be able to tune it the way you want. So this is what you end up with. Basically nothing. I mean, this is what happens when you try to crawl one of these. This is what you end up with when you run it through the WISwag tool. You get coverage on all the endpoints. You get payloads that make sense. You get custom parameter rules. So you can see that we are identifying this as a parameter. That's what this is telling you right here, that this 123, this guy right here, is actually a parameter. That tells WebInspect, hey, you can fuzz that. Because again, we don't normally recognize that URL segments are fuzzable unless you tell us. And if you also look at the scan settings and go to custom parameters, these rules were automatically generated by the tool. So, in this case, there's only 4, but you can imagine on a large API, there could be dozens. I mean, there can be a lot of custom parameter rules, and you don't want to have to do that by hand. So in terms of a real scan, obviously I'm not going to scan the Swagger site, because those guys probably wouldn't be too happy about that. But here is a an internal test site that kind of mimics the pet store site, and this is kind of what you would expect in terms of results. The other cool thing about using the Swagger tool is that the research team has recently developed some checks that are specific to Swagger. And when you use the tool to generate the settings, we actually can bake the information about the Swagger definition into the scan settings, and then the engines have access to that. So this is a test site that's basically testing that. But you'll see some stuff like OAuth communication channel. That's because the Swagger definition defines some of the endpoints to use OAuth for security. And we've tested that, and you can see it says Swagger specification allows URLs, blah, blah, blah. We're able to discover these issues because we have that information about Swagger definitions baked in the settings file. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Won't go through all these, but so the ability to tune it with the configuration file, the using the -s option is the option you want to use, even though there's other outputs, and I'm not going to go through these, but some of these are useful for debugging, like HTTP output. It'll give you a raw dump, just a text file dump of all the HTTP endpoints, which might be useful if you want to take those and run them through another tool like Postman or something. You could use it for that. If you just want to get the web macro, you can do that, but again, you're not going to get the parameter rules, and you're not going to get the Swagger information that's going to be useful for these sort of checks that look for Swagger-specific vulnerabilities. The only way you get it all is using the -s output option, which will generate a full settings file. So you can always go and edit that settings file and make changes if you want, but if you use one of these other options, you're going to be missing out on stuff. So I'll go ahead and open it up. Hopefully you guys have some questions. Okay, so here's a question. Is it for just Swagger, or will it work with any JSON supplied file? It's just Swagger. I mean, any JSON supplied file, I don't know what that would, I guess, so if they sent you a payload or something like that, you would probably use a different workflow. If they're just giving you an example of here's what the payload looks like, you would probably just use something else. Like you could use the proxy tool or something to capture that request. But it's a good point though. So for you guys, I guess the question is more like, how do you know that there is a Swagger definition, right? Like, why would you even know that? Get a list of endpoints. You might just try going to the API root and see what you get back. Like if they give you something like, /pets or whatever, try exploring around and see if you can find it, because you might get lucky. If it's really well designed, if the API is designed for end users in mind, they're probably going to make it easy to find. And then again, what you want is not this. This is the Swagger UI. You want this guy, right? You want the JSON. This is what you want to feed into the tool. Yeah, Postman collections being translated, absolutely. There's tools for almost, if you get anything that's like an API definition, try to see if there's something that'll convert it into Swagger, and then run that through the WISwag tool, because you're going to get better results. So yeah, Postman, I know there's one for Waddle that kind of works okay. There's one for Ramble that seems to work really well. And yeah, I get that most of the time you won't know. So if you can, now that you are aware that this is out there, explore and see if they've got any, anywhere in the API, if they expose any kind of API documentation, even if it's not Swagger, go out and see if there's something that'll convert that thing into Swagger, and then run that through the WISwag tool, because you're going to get much better results. So I think we're right at the time limit.